Ben Shapiro loses his first debate.
So why do you need the idea of revelatory God who speaks to human beings?
Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was?
I think William Lane Craig has such a good argument here.
Asks him, are you the Messiah?
This narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy.
You can tell the weather, but you can't tell that the Son of Man is standing right in front of you.
So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of...
Ben Shapiro loses his first debate is what a lot of people have titled this video, the segment we're going to play. Now, I've made videos on Ben Shapiro before. I've made a short video that got 2 million views of him saying Jesus was just a rebel trying to overthrow the Roman government. Now, obviously, he's an Orthodox Jew, so they don't believe Jesus is or was God, unlike Protestant Christians, which what I would be, is Jesus for sure is God. He came really as a man and died and then rose 3 days later. Now, he had William Lane Craig on his show, and William Lane Craig is just an incredible Christian apologist that I think just defends the gospel, defends the resurrection, defends Jesus in an intellectual way better than anybody else. But what happens when him and Ben Shapiro get together? I'm not going to label this Ben Shapiro loses debate, or maybe I will for the clicks. But really, I think William Lane Craig has such a good argument here. So let's react to this and watch.
Opponent to him.
And Ben Shapiro, Daily Wire, please don't take my video down and copyright me. I'm trying to react to this, so if you guys see me pausing it and making little remarks, it's so they don't take it down for copyright. This is fair use, okay? Fair use.
Yes. The unmoved mover, all of these things. So why do you need the idea of revelatory God who speaks to human beings?
Ben wants to know, why do we need Jesus? That's the whole argument. I know it's 26 minutes in, but his question is like, why Jesus? Why do we need him?
The arguments that we've discussed already narrow down the field of the world religions to basically the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or perhaps deism. The question as to which of these is true, I think, stands or falls upon the person of Jesus of Nazareth.
So what distinguishes all the other religions, the main ones, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, or being an Orthodox Jew, and it's Jesus. It's the resurrection. All the other gods are still in the grave. Jesus rose from the grave.
Who do you think Jesus of Nazareth was? Jesus claimed to be the decisive self-revelation of God. And I believe that we have good reasons to believe that those claims were true and that therefore the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Okay.
So what is the proof?
Remember, Ben Shapiro does not believe Jesus is or was God at any point. He believes he was a revolutionary. I'm quoting him from Joe Rogan podcast. He's a revolutionary that tried to overthrow the Roman government and got killed in doing so.
That Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels.
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had...
In other words, Jesus is making these claims to be the Savior and then also to be God. But how does he prove these claims are true? Now we know John 10 does say the miracles are one of the ways he proves it, but obviously the resurrection is another way.
Self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am. And then virtually quoting from Daniel, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power. And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, you have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need? And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, that this is actually a punishable offense, even. That there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah.
He's literally describing what the Pharisees and the Sadducees believed, is that when Jesus came, he was outside of what they thought he was going to be, thinking he's going to overthrow Rome and build his kingdom, when not realizing it was a spiritual kingdom. And Jesus even told the Pharisees and Sadducees, you can tell the weather, but you can't tell that the Son of Man is standing right in front of you. And this is what they couldn't understand. How could a man come in meekness? How could he come washing people's feet? How could he come picking fishermen and tax collectors to be his disciples? It completely went against everything religion believed. And that's what Ben Shapiro is like, it didn't match. Jesus showing up.
The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel.
They're looking for a political figure, and they still are. Orthodox Jews are still waiting for Jesus to come and be a political figure.
Maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this. Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection?
So the resurrection, he's saying everything lies on the resurrection. And Paul said this, if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, then everything we're doing is a waste of time, is worthless. And there's no forgiveness for our sin. There's nothing to put our hope in. So the resurrection is the focal point of proving that we are the only true religion, that Jesus is the only one that ever rose from the dead, rose himself from
divinity.
the dead.
So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims.
And claimed that he was going to raise himself up from the dead.
If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document
Ben's coming out with all the atheist questions to
be
Christians.
reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers.
Empty
Secondly
too.
would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three.
Actually, most people don't know, for 40 days, Jesus was appearing to them, teaching them about the kingdom. But even after his resurrection, appeared to people as well.
Would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theory meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make back.
Ben's like, I'm not ready to go there with you. How could you debate William Lane Craig? Really, after the way he talks, how well-versed he is, his knowledge.
I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
On the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim. There's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s.
Yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have, and they still do that 20 years after his.
He's trying to infer that they could be doing the same thing about Jesus.
That's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experienced it. Right. So, especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's
I doubt
sufficient.
this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up.
Yeah, there it is. He said, I doubt this man's tomb is empty. Get him. That's it. That's it. That's the bottom line. There's an empty tomb in Jerusalem. There's an empty tomb in Jerusalem.
So I wouldn't know, but the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then...
Yeah, that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time.
Good.
The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those
Correct.
events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion.
Super interesting video. William Lane Craig on Ben Shapiro show. A lot of people label this as Ben Shapiro loses his first debate. It's an hour-long video. I'm not going to react to the whole video. I just wanted to show that part that I thought was really good when I was watching it. And I think William Lane Craig is amazing at laying out that Jesus, for sure, is God, rose from the dead, was God. Say it however you want. There's an empty tomb in Jerusalem. The God that we serve is the only way. He's the way, the truth, and the life. I pray that Ben Shapiro comes to the knowledge of the truth. I pray that Ben Shapiro finds Jesus before he passes away and before it's too late. The Orthodox view that Jesus hasn't come, he's this political figure, he's going to still come, is completely false. Not just to the testament of our own lives and our own testimonies, but the historical evidence, the archaeological evidence. There's so many arguments and evidence that can be made for Jesus, and that there's an empty tomb and he rose from the dead. Jesus said, I will raise myself up, I will raise from the dead, and he did. And God did raise him from the dead. So what a great video. Let me know if you're still watching. Say still here in the comments down below. We're live Monday, Tuesday, and Friday. Join the live streams. Where have you been? I miss you. And we'll see you guys in the next video. God bless.